The CB crackled once, then went silent in a way no trucker forgets. In 2017, a father and son lost contact near mile marker 214, and 9 years later, their rig sat exactly where they'd called for help, but every window was sealed from the inside. They were pulling refrigerated freight down Interstate 80 through Nevada when it happened. The father had been driving for 32 years. The son had just gotten his commercial license 6 months earlier. Dispatch heard the father's voice at 11:47 p.m. He asked if anyone else was seeing the lights near the shoulder. Then the line went dead. 3 other drivers were within 10 miles that night. None of them saw anything unusual. None of them heard the call. The highway patrol found the truck at dawn. It was parked on the shoulder exactly at mile marker 214. The engine was off. The hazard lights were still blinking. The trailer was locked. The refrigeration unit was running at the correct temperature. Every door on the cab was locked from the inside. Every window was rolled up and latched. The father's coffee cup was still warm in the holder. The son's phone was plugged into the charger. Both of their jackets were draped over the seats. The cargo was 28 pallets of frozen vegetables. They were headed to a distribution center in Utah. Every seal on the trailer was intact. The bill of lading matched perfectly. The refrigeration logs showed no temperature spikes. When they opened the trailer 3 hours later, everything was exactly where it should have been. The pallets were strapped down. The load hadn't shifted. There was no sign anyone had opened those doors since the warehouse in California. The father's logbook was sitting on the dashboard. The last entry was at 11:30 p.m. He'd written the mile marker, the fuel level, and a note about checking tire pressure. His handwriting was steady. There were no crossed-out words. The son's personal log was in the sleeper berth. He'd been documenting his first long haul in a small notebook. The last line read, "Dad says we'll make good time if the weather holds." The page wasn't finished. The pen was still clipped to the cover. Their families reported them missing within 6 hours. The father's wife knew his route. She knew his schedule. She knew he called every night at midnight. When the call didn't come, she tried his phone 4 times. It rang but no one answered. The son's mother did the same thing. Both phones were later found in the truck. They were fully charged. There were no outgoing calls after 11:47 p.m. The last text either of them sent was to dispatch. It confirmed their estimated arrival time. Search teams covered 80 miles of highway in both directions. They used dogs trained to track people in open terrain. They checked every rest area, every truck stop, every pull-off within a 2-hour radius. They interviewed the drivers who'd been on that stretch of road. They pulled footage from every camera at the way stations. The dogs picked up a scent near the truck. They lost it 30 feet away. The cameras showed the rig passing through the westbound way station at 10:53 p.m. It never appeared at the next checkpoint. The CB radio in the truck was still set to channel 19. That's the channel most truckers use. When the investigators tested it, the radio worked perfectly. The father's last transmission was recorded by another driver. He happened to be scanning channels. The recording was scratchy but clear enough. You could hear the father ask about the lights. Then there was a pause, then a soft click, then nothing. The driver who recorded it said he didn't think much of it at the time. Lights on the shoulder usually meant a breakdown or an accident. The truck itself had no damage. The paint was clean. The tires were inflated to the correct pressure. The engine had 53,000 miles since its last service. The maintenance logs were up to date. The brakes passed inspection. The fifth-wheel coupling showed no signs of stress. When they checked the fuel tank, it was 3/4 full. The father had filled up in Reno 4 hours before the disappearance. The receipt was still in the cup holder. One detail troubled the investigators more than anything else. The windows were sealed from the inside, but there was a thin layer of condensation on the exterior glass. It was a cold night. Condensation wasn't unusual, but the pattern was. On the driver's side window, the condensation had been disturbed. Someone had touched the glass from the outside. The smudge was recent. It was about the size of a palm. It was positioned exactly where someone would press if they were trying to see inside. The passenger window had a similar mark. Both marks were too high to have been made by someone standing on the ground. The son's notebook became a critical piece of evidence. In the weeks before the disappearance, he'd been writing about the things his father taught him: how to read the road, how to manage the logbook, how to stay alert on long, empty highways. On the second-to-last page, he'd written something that didn't fit the rest. He'd drawn a small diagram of the truck. He marked 3 points around it. Next to the diagram, he'd written something his father told him: if you ever see lights that don't make sense, don't stop to look. Just keep driving. The handwriting was hurried. The pen had pressed hard enough to indent the next page. 9 years went by. The case stayed open, but the leads dried up. The families held memorials, but never funerals. The truck was released from evidence and sold at auction. A small fleet operator bought it. He put it back on the road. The new driver reported nothing unusual. It ran routes through the same stretch of Nevada without incident. Then in late 2025, a highway maintenance crew was doing work near mile marker 214. They were replacing a section of guardrail. It had been damaged in a winter storm. When they pulled up the old posts, they found something buried in the gravel. It was a small metal box. Truckers use that kind to store documents. The box was rusted but intact. Inside were 2 items. The first was the father's commercial driver's license. The expiration date was still 2 years away when he disappeared. The second was a folded piece of paper. It was a handwritten note on the back of a fuel receipt. The note was in the father's handwriting. It said, "If anyone finds this, we tried to leave. The doors wouldn't open. The windows wouldn't break. We could see people outside, but they couldn't hear us. The lights came back. We're going to try the emergency exit." The paper was creased, like it had been folded many times. The ink was faded but legible. At the bottom of the note was a single line in different handwriting. It was the son's. It said, "I'm sorry I didn't listen." The box was found 30 feet from where the truck had been parked. It was buried 6 inches deep. There was no sign of digging. The gravel around it looked undisturbed. When they showed the note to the families, the father's wife confirmed the handwriting. The son's mother did the same. Both women said the note didn't make sense. The emergency exit on that model of truck was a roof hatch. It required a lever inside the cab. If they'd used it, the hatch would have been found open. The truck was inspected 3 times after the disappearance. The hatch was closed and locked every time. The investigators reopened the case. They brought in new analysts. They reviewed every piece of evidence with updated technology. They tested the truck's locking mechanism. They recreated the conditions of that night. They couldn't explain how the box ended up buried outside the truck. They couldn't explain the note. They couldn't explain why the emergency hatch showed no signs of use. One of the senior investigators had been on the original case. He'd retired, but came back as a consultant. He remembered something the other drivers had said. 3 of them reported unusual radio interference that night, the kind that makes the speakers hiss and pop. One driver said his GPS lost signal for about 2 minutes. It happened near mile marker 214. Another said his headlights flickered. All of them said it happened around 11:45 p.m. None of them thought it was connected at the time. The road near mile marker 214 runs through flat open desert. There are no trees, no buildings, no structures tall enough to block a signal. The area is used for testing by a nearby military range, but the range is 20 miles south. The military confirmed no operations that night. No aircraft, no exercises, no equipment failures. The nearest cell tower is 11 miles west. It showed no outages. The father's phone tried to connect to it 6 times. Every attempt was between 11:47 p.m. and midnight. Every attempt failed. The spot where the box was buried is visible from the road. If someone had been digging there, a passing driver would have seen it. The highway patrol increased patrols after the disappearance. They checked that stretch twice a night for 3 months. None of them reported anything unusual. The box would have been buried during that time. The rust on it suggested it had been in the ground for years. The families asked for the truck to be re-examined. It had been sold and resold. The current owner agreed. When they inspected it again, they found scratches on the interior of the driver's side door. The scratches were near the lock mechanism. They were consistent with someone trying to force the lock from the inside. The scratches hadn't been documented in the original inspection. Either they'd been missed or they'd appeared later. The paint around them was chipped. The metal underneath showed no rust. The fuel receipt that the note was written on came from a station in Reno. The father had stopped there at 7:18 p.m. The receipt showed he'd bought 43 gallons of diesel and a large coffee. The station's cameras had been reviewed during the original investigation. The footage showed the father and son walking into the store together. They paid for the fuel. They bought snacks. They left together. Nothing about their behavior suggested distress. The son was smiling in one of the frames. The note mentioned lights. The father's CB transmission mentioned lights. The son's notebook mentioned lights. But no other driver saw them. The highway that night was clear. The moon was nearly full. Visibility was good. If there had been something on the shoulder, someone would have noticed. The stretch near mile marker 214 is straight for 5 miles in both directions. You can see headlights from a long way off. The refrigeration unit on the trailer had a backup power system. If the truck's engine stopped, the unit would switch to its own diesel generator. The generator had enough fuel to run for 12 hours. When they found the truck, the generator hadn't been used. The main engine had been off for at least 6 hours. The temperature inside the trailer had dropped by 8 degrees. The vegetables were starting to thaw. If the father had parked intentionally, he would have left the engine running. He would have switched to the backup. He'd been hauling refrigerated freight for 15 years. He knew the protocol. The son's phone had a tracking app. His mother had installed it. She'd wanted to follow his first long haul. The app showed his location updating every 10 minutes. It updated until 11:47 p.m. Then it stopped. The last recorded position was mile marker 214. The app tried to update 6 more times. Each attempt failed. The phone's GPS log showed it was still searching for a signal at midnight. Then the log ended. The coffee cup in the holder was tested for fingerprints. It had the father's prints and no one else's. The coffee inside was still liquid when they found it. That meant the heater in the cup holder had been on. The heater runs off the truck's battery. If the engine is off for more than 30 minutes, the battery starts to drain. When they tested the battery, it was at 40%. That suggested the engine had been off for less than 3 hours. But the father's last logbook entry was at 11:30 p.m. If the truck had been parked since then, the battery should have been lower. There were no footprints around the truck. The ground was hard-packed gravel. It doesn't hold prints well, but the area directly behind the trailer was soft dirt. If someone had walked there, it would have shown. The investigators checked it carefully. There was nothing. No shoe prints. No tire tracks from another vehicle. No signs anyone had been near the trailer. Only the highway patrol officer who found it had approached. The officer who discovered the truck wrote a detailed report. He'd been driving his usual patrol route. He saw the rig on the shoulder. He pulled over to check if the driver needed help. The hazard lights were blinking. He approached the cab and knocked on the window. No response. He tried the door. Locked. He walked around the truck. All the doors were locked. He called it in and waited for backup. When the second officer arrived, they decided to force entry. They used a slim jim on the passenger door. It took 4 minutes. When they opened it, the cab was empty. The keys were in the ignition. The father's jacket was on the seat. The second officer noticed the condensation marks on the windows. He thought someone might have been looking in. He took photos. The marks were clear in the pictures. They were too high to have been made by the officers. Both of them were under 6 feet tall. The marks were at least 6.5 feet off the ground. When they measured later, they confirmed it. Someone taller than either officer had touched those windows, or someone had been standing on something. The father was 5'9". The son was 5'11". Neither of them could have made those marks from the ground. There was nothing near the truck to stand on. No crates, no toolboxes, no equipment. The truck's steps were on the opposite side. Even if they'd climbed up and leaned over, the angle wouldn't match. The marks were straight on. Someone had pressed their palm flat against the glass. The trailer's GPS tracker showed it had been stationary since 11:49 p.m. The tracker was independent of the truck's system. It ran on its own battery. It used its own signal. The company that owned the trailer confirmed the data. The unit hadn't moved. It hadn't been tampered with. The signal hadn't dropped. If someone had moved the trailer and brought it back, the GPS would have recorded it. The record was clean. One of the investigators interviewed a driver who'd been hauling the same route for 20 years. The driver said that stretch of highway had a reputation, not for accidents, not for breakdowns, for silence. He said the CB radio always went quiet, near mile marker 214. He said it happened to him at least once a month. He said it usually lasted a few seconds, sometimes a minute. He said he'd reported it to the company. They blamed interference from the military range. He said other drivers noticed it too. No one made a big deal out of it. The traffic on Interstate 80 through Nevada is steady, but not heavy. On a weeknight in October, you might see a dozen trucks an hour. The father and son disappeared on a Tuesday. Between 11 p.m. and midnight, 4 trucks passed through that area. All 4 drivers were interviewed. None of them saw the rig on the shoulder. The highway patrol officer found it at 6:14 a.m. That's more than 6 hours. If the truck had been there the whole time, at least one driver should have noticed it. The father's wife said her husband never talked about strange experiences on the road. He was practical. He didn't believe in anything he couldn't see or touch. The son's mother said her son had always been curious. He asked a lot of questions. He liked puzzles. He kept a journal. The notebook they found in the truck was his third one. The first 2 were at home. She gave them to the investigators. They were full of observations about the road, weather patterns, traffic rhythms, small details most people wouldn't notice. On one page he'd written something his father told him. The road teaches you if you pay attention. The last entry in the son's notebook at home was dated 3 days before the disappearance. He'd written about a conversation with his father. They'd been talking about what to do if something went wrong on the road. The father had told him to stay with the truck, never leave the vehicle, always wait for help. The son had underlined that part twice. Below it he'd written, "But what if help doesn't come?" The box they found buried near the road was a standard document case. Truckers used them to store paperwork, registration, insurance, permits. The father's truck had one mounted inside the cab. When they checked, the box was still there. It was empty. Someone had removed the contents. Someone put them in the buried box. The word box had scratches on the outside. They looked fresh. The metal underneath the rust was bright. If the box had been buried for 9 years, the scratches should have shown rust too. The note inside the box raised more questions than it answered. The father wrote that the doors wouldn't open, but the doors weren't damaged. The locks worked perfectly. The investigators tested them dozens of times. They opened from the inside, with no resistance. The father wrote that the windows wouldn't break. The windows were standard tempered glass. A hammer would have shattered them easily. A heavy tool would have done the job. The truck had a tire iron in the storage compartment. The tire iron was still there. It hadn't been used. The son's line at the bottom of the note was harder to interpret. "I'm sorry I didn't listen." Listen to what? The notebook mentioned his father's advice about lights. Don't stop to look, just keep driving. But they had stopped. The truck was parked. If the son felt he should have listened, it meant he'd made a choice. It meant he disagreed with his father about something. The families couldn't think of anything the two had argued about. Everyone said they got along. The son respected his father. The father was proud of his son. The emergency exit on the truck's roof was a hatch. It was designed for exactly this kind of situation. If the doors failed, if the cab filled with smoke, if there was an emergency, you could open the hatch. You could climb out. The lever was clearly marked. The father would have known about it. The son would have been trained on it. The hatch had been inspected 3 times. It was locked from the inside. The lever hadn't been touched. There was a thin layer of dust on it. If someone had tried to use it, the dust would have been disturbed. The truck had a manual override for the door locks. It was a safety feature. If the electronic system failed, you could unlock the doors manually. The override was a small red lever near the driver's seat. It was easy to reach. It was impossible to miss. When they checked the lever, it was in the locked position. There were no fingerprints on it. There was no sign anyone had tried to use it. The windshield wipers had been used recently. That was clear from the pattern on the glass. But it hadn't rained that night. The weather report showed clear skies. The father's last logbook entry mentioned no precipitation. The other drivers on the road reported dry conditions. If the wipers had been used, it was for something else. Maybe to clear dust. Maybe to clear condensation. The investigators couldn't determine when they'd been activated. The truck's electronic logging device recorded all activity. That's the digital time card every commercial truck uses now. The device showed the truck traveling at 62 miles per hour at 11:46 p.m. At 11:48 p.m., the speed dropped to 0. The engine stayed on for another 11 minutes. Then it shut off. The device recorded no door openings, no unusual vibrations, no sudden stops. The transition from highway speed to complete stop took less than 90 seconds. The father had been using the cruise control. The system was still engaged when they found the truck. That meant he hadn't touched the brake pedal to disengage it. He'd used the clutch, or he'd turned off the engine while the truck was still rolling. Neither action made sense. Experienced drivers don't shut off the engine on the highway. They don't coast to a stop. They use the brakes. They follow procedure. The son's seatbelt was unbuckled. The father's was still fastened. That suggested the son had been moving around the cab. Maybe he'd gone to the sleeper berth. Maybe he'd been reaching for something. The investigators tried to determine what he might have been doing. They couldn't find any evidence. His phone was on the passenger seat. His notebook was in the sleeper. His jacket was draped over the back of the seat. Nothing seemed out of place. The truck's air pressure gauge showed normal levels. That's important, because air brakes depend on pressure. If the pressure drops too low, the brakes lock automatically. It's a safety feature. The father's truck had no mechanical issues. The air system was functioning correctly. If the brakes had engaged accidentally, the gauge would have shown it. The pressure was right where it should be. The steering wheel had a light coating of dust. Not much, just enough to notice. The dust pattern suggested no one had gripped the wheel for several hours. But the father's last logbook entry was only 7 hours before the truck was found. The dust shouldn't have accumulated that quickly. The investigators tested the dust. It was ordinary road dust. Nothing unusual about the composition, nothing that would explain the rapid buildup. The cab's interior temperature was 51 degrees when they opened the door. It had been a cold night. The outside temperature was 38 degrees. Without the engine running, the cab would have cooled down gradually. The investigators calculated that the engine had been off for about 6 hours. That matched the timeline. But it didn't explain why the coffee was still warm. The cup holder heater couldn't have kept the coffee warm that long, not with the battery draining. The truck's mirrors were adjusted for someone taller than the father. The driver's side mirror was angled up. The passenger's side mirror was angled out. The father was 5'9". He would have needed the mirrors lower. The son was 5'11". He would have needed them higher. But the son didn't have a commercial license yet. He wasn't allowed to drive. He could only ride along and learn. The investigators couldn't explain why the mirrors were adjusted for him. The fuel gauge showed 3/4 of a tank. The father had filled up in Reno. He'd bought 43 gallons. The truck's fuel capacity was 150 gallons. The math didn't add up. If he'd filled up in Reno with 43 gallons, the tank should have been closer to full. The investigators checked the fuel records. The receipt was accurate. The pump records confirmed it. 43 gallons at 7:18 p.m. So where did the fuel go? The truck had traveled 112 miles between Reno and mile marker 214. The father's truck averaged 6 miles per gallon. That's standard for a loaded rig. 112 miles would have used about 19 gallons. If he'd started with 43 gallons, added to whatever was already in the tank, he should have had more than 3/4 left. The investigators recalculated multiple times. The numbers didn't work. One possibility was a fuel leak, but there was no diesel on the ground near the truck. No stains, no smell. The fuel lines were intact. The tank showed no damage. If fuel had leaked, it would have left evidence. The investigators found none. The father's wallet was in his jacket pocket. It contained his license, 3 credit cards, and $62 in cash. Nothing was missing. The son's wallet was in his backpack. It had his license, 1 debit card, and $20. Both wallets were exactly where they should be. If someone had taken the father and son, why leave the wallets? Why leave the cash? The truck's cargo was worth about $12,000. That's not unusual for a refrigerated load. The vegetables were ordinary produce. Nothing exotic, nothing high value. The trailer was worth more than the cargo. If someone wanted to steal something, they would have taken the whole rig. They would have taken the wallets. They wouldn't have locked the doors from the inside. The father had a medical condition. He took medication for high blood pressure. His wife confirmed he'd been taking it regularly. She said he kept a bottle in the truck. The investigators found it in the cab. It was in the cup holder next to the coffee. The bottle was 3/4 full. The prescription showed he'd refilled it 2 weeks earlier. He hadn't missed any doses. The son had no medical conditions. He was healthy. He'd passed his commercial physical exam 2 weeks before the disappearance. The exam included drug testing. He was clean. His mother said he didn't drink. He didn't smoke. He was serious about becoming a professional driver. He wanted to take over his father's route someday. The stretch of highway near mile marker 214 has seen 3 other disappearances in the past 40 years. None of them involved truck drivers. One was a motorcyclist in 1983. One was a hitchhiker in 1997. One was a tourist in 2009. All 3 cases remain unsolved. The investigators looked for connections. They found none. The circumstances were completely different. The only common factor was the location. The motorcyclist had been traveling east. His bike was found on the shoulder with the kickstand down. The engine was off. His helmet was hanging from the handlebar. He was never seen again. The hitchhiker had been picked up by a driver who dropped him off near mile marker 214. The driver saw him walk toward the rest area. That was the last confirmed sighting. The tourist had stopped to take photos of the desert. His car was found with the driver's door open. His camera was on the front seat. The last photo on the camera showed the highway stretching into the distance. Local residents avoid that stretch of road at night, not because of the disappearances, because of the silence. They say the usual desert sounds stop near mile marker 214. No wind, no insects, no distant traffic, just silence. The investigators interviewed 12 residents. All of them described the same thing. A zone of complete quiet that lasts for about a quarter mile. None of them could explain it. None of them thought it was dangerous. Just strange. A geologist examined the area. He found nothing unusual about the terrain. No underground caverns, no fault lines, no mineral deposits that might affect electronics. The soil composition was typical for the region. The rock formations were ordinary. There was no geological explanation for the radio interference. There was no geological explanation for the silence. A meteorologist reviewed weather data for the night of the disappearance. There had been no storms, no unusual atmospheric conditions, no temperature inversions that might affect radio signals. The wind had been light. Visibility had been excellent. There was nothing in the weather that would explain what happened. The military range 20 miles south was contacted again. They provided detailed logs for that night. No aircraft in the area, no ground operations, no equipment testing, no radar activity. The range commander said they were aware of the disappearances over the years. He said they'd investigated internally multiple times. They'd found no connection to military operations. The nearest town is 43 miles west of mile marker 214. It's a small community, population 800. The residents know about the highway incidents. Some of them have theories. Most of them think it's just coincidence. Bad luck. The desert is a big place. Strange things happen. People get lost. People make mistakes. That's what the sheriff says. He's been in office for 22 years. He's seen all the cases. He doesn't believe in anything supernatural. He believes in evidence. And the evidence always runs out. The case remains open. The FBI has a file. The state police have a file. Both agencies review it periodically. They look for new leads. They compare it to other cases. So far, nothing has connected. The father and son are still listed as missing persons. Their families check in with investigators every few months. They ask if there's been any progress. The answer is always the same. We're still looking. We haven't forgotten. The truck was sold 3 times after the auction. Each owner used it without incident. The current owner has put 70,000 miles on it. He hauls the same kind of freight. He drives the same routes. He passes through mile marker 214 regularly. He says the truck runs fine. He says he's never had any problems. He says he doesn't think about what happened. It's just a truck. It's just a road. But sometimes, late at night when he passes that spot, his CB goes quiet for a few seconds. Sometimes his GPS flickers. Sometimes he thinks he sees something on the shoulder. He doesn't stop. He keeps driving. That's what you do. That's what every driver knows. If something doesn't make sense on the road, you don't investigate. You just keep moving. You get to where you're going. You make your delivery. You go home. The father's wife visits the spot twice a year. Once on the anniversary of the disappearance. Once on her husband's birthday. She brings flowers. She stands there for a few minutes. She doesn't cry anymore. She just stands and remembers. Then she gets back in her car and drives away. The son's mother goes with her sometimes. They don't talk much. There's nothing left to say. The investigators still can't explain the buried box. They can't explain the note. They can't explain how 2 men vanished from a locked truck on an open highway with other drivers nearby. They can't explain the condensation marks. They can't explain the silence. They've done everything they can with the evidence they have. They've followed every lead. They've tested every theory. None of it adds up. 9 years later, the highway looks the same. The mile marker is still there. The shoulder is still gravel. The desert still stretches out in every direction. Traffic still flows. Trucks still haul freight. The road doesn't care what happened. The road just keeps going. And every now and then, a driver will key up the CB near mile marker 214 and ask if anyone else is seeing the lights. And every now and then, no one answers.